What do you think of when you hear the idea of being called to ministry? Today, we're going to talk about being called to a ministry behind the scenes, a ministry that nobody sees happen. And we're going to talk about serving behind the scenes when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are getting towards the end of our study in First Chronicles. And we're going to see today in chapter 26 an interesting chapter that brings up some meditation points for us as we get into it. What pops into your mind when we say somebody's called to ministry?
Usually someone becoming a pastor, probably.
Okay, pastor, maybe a missionary.
Yeah.
Maybe a leader in the church, like the worship leader, somebody that is serving in the forefront, the visible servants, right?
Yeah.
Today in chapter 26, we're going to talk about guys that are behind the scenes, people that serve that aren't really seen in the forefront of ministry. And yet, through First Chronicles chapter 26, we're going to see God calls them very specifically to serve in some of these positions and see these positions as parallels that might be in our churches. Now, first thing we see is a term that we've talked about before. In verse 1, we see for the divisions of the gatekeepers, there were, and it talks about the people that are from families that are going to serve as gatekeepers. Now, again, we see God calling gatekeepers. If you look all the way back to chapter 9:19.
Shallum, the son of Kor, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, and his relatives of his father's house, the Korahites, were in charge of the work of the service, gatekeepers of the tent, and their fathers had been in charge of the camp of the Lord, keepers of the entrance.
Okay, it's talking about guys that were gatekeepers. That's where we heard that term first time. Gatekeepers in the traveling tent. And then
Yeah.
it's talking in that context about, and now they're going to be gatekeepers in the temple whenever it's built, because it's not built yet.
Okay.
And then look at chapter 23, verse 5.
And 4,000 were gatekeepers, and 4,000 were praising the Lord with instruments, which
Okay.
David made for giving praise.
So we see the musicians and the gatekeepers here, and we talked about that when we did the study in chapter 23. But here we see this pattern in First Chronicles where the first time it's talking about the heritage, who's related to people that can serve in that area. And then the second time it starts talking about where they serve. And now we're talking about the specifics of what they're going to be doing.
Okay.
All right. So we've seen that pattern through First Chronicles, and here again we see it for the behind the scenes people. And he uses the term again in verse 1, the Korahites, talking about the son of Kor, and then it talks through these people, and it gets down to a name we recognize in Obed-Edom. Do you remember the name Obed-Edom?
Yeah, it rings a bell.
All right. This is interesting because in verse 4, it talks about Obed-Edom. He is a godly man that we see here in verse 5. God had indeed blessed him. It mentions him again. Read verse 8. It's interesting.
All these were the sons of Obed-Edom. They and their sons and their relatives were able men with strength for the service. 62 from Obed-Edom. Now,
these are 62 that are going to be leaders in that group of 4,000 that we read about earlier. But if you flip back to First Chronicles chapter 13, verse 14, we're tying things together here as we go.
And the ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed the family of Obed-Edom and all that he had.
So there's that term again of God had indeed blessed him. Why?
Yeah.
Because he was the place that when they were afraid of the Ark of the Covenant, they didn't bring it to Jerusalem. They gave it to the house of Obed-Edom. But he took the Ark of the Covenant into his own home, and God blessed him for that faithful servant. That's, again, a behind-the-scene thing. We talk about the priests who served the Ark of the Covenant, but we don't talk about whose house it was in. until
Yeah.
Obed-Edom is mentioned, okay? And now he's mentioned again as the progenitor of a group of people that were going to serve in the temple. You see how it's going along here? These guys in verse 8 were related to Obed-Edom. And it says, relatives were able men with strength for the service. 62. All right, now, one of the things we can get from that verse, I've got it underlined in red, able men with strength for the service. One of the things that hit me was in serving, what even behind the scenes serving, it takes a commitment of strength that for these background ministries, God chose men who had the strength to do it.
Okay.
A lot of times we think of guys in the church, we don't really think of them as being strong servants, people that are the ushers, people that collect the offering, people that make sure the offering is recorded correctly, people who are greeters. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We say, oh, they're an usher. That doesn't take a whole lot, but they're servants in the house of the Lord, and they are serving faithfully using strength that God gives them to serve. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we shouldn't look at people in the church that are serving coffee or whatever else as throwaway duties. We should think of them in the context of faithfully serving the Lord using the strength God gives them. Okay?
Yeah.
Now that's
Makes sense.
early, that's early in this chapter, but I think it's a good thing to take into the chapter as we're thinking about serving behind the scenes. Okay?
Okay.
Now we'll keep that in the back of our mind here, but I like that. They were able men with strength for service. I got to share something personal here. Years and years ago, 50 years ago, I was praying about where God wanted me to go. I felt called to the ministry, and I went through a list. Was that a pastor? Was that a missionary? Was that on staff at a parachurch organization like the Navigators or Campus Crusade for Christ? What was it that God wanted me to serve? And after a whole day of fasting and prayer, God's answer to me disappointed me greatly. And it was, I want you to serve as a support person, not as a frontline person. And I was very disappointed. And I think we see some of that here in that these are positions that are not the glamour positions, but they are positions of ministry, and it takes strength to do them. So if we move on, we're looking down at these lists. Verse 9, we're talking about 62 men from Obed-Edom. Then we're talking about 18 valiant men from Meshelemah and his relatives, 18. That makes 80 guys. Then we go on. Verse 11 talks about Hilkiah and the relatives of Hoshea that were 13. So there were 3 divisions from the Korahites, and there's 1 division from Merari. If you break that down, do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a group of 93 guys that are kind of heads of divisions. And then it goes into this section of the gatekeepers. Let's read from verse 12 down to verse 14.
Okay. To these divisions of the gatekeepers, the chief men were given duties like their relatives to minister in the house of the Lord. They cast lots, the small and the great alike, according to their fathers' households for every gate. The lot to the east fell to Shelemiah. Then they cast lots for his son Zechariah, a counselor with insight, and his lot came out to the north.
Now, we're going to continue this, but I wanted to make a couple points here. If you notice in verse 12, the divisions of the gatekeepers, the chief men. So this is not a list of the 4,000 gatekeepers. This is a list of the chief men of the 4,000 gatekeepers. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if we go, hey, these numbers don't jive, there's 4,000 gatekeepers, and here we're talking about people in the hundreds. These are chief men who are the foremans or the supervisors or the heads of these individual ministries.
Okay.
We get that from looking at that verse 12. They were given duties like their relatives to minister in the house of the Lord. Again, these ministries are as gatekeepers. This would be the equivalent in our church today of maybe it's a greeter who's standing at the door and he's just greeting people as they're coming in. That would be a gatekeeper. One of the terms that The Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, used for gatekeeper was porter. And if you go to an English college like Oxford, there are dorms for the students, and each of the dorms has a porter that takes care of that dorm. He's a gatekeeper. He checks
Okay.
people in, checks people out, makes sure everybody is accounted for. That's a gatekeeper. So that's this idea we get, and we can see that in greeters. We can see it in ushers in the church today, people called to be gatekeepers. Not a prestigious job, but a very important job as far as God's word is concerned. And we go back, and the other thing I wanted to point out was we've seen this before. Back in chapter 24, verse 5, we saw this. They cast lot. And here the chief men, and they cast lots, the small and the great alike, according to their father's household for every gate. So there was this group of guys, and they cast lots to see which one went to which gate. We talked about that before, that this is not gambling. It's not the luck of the draw or the luck of the dice. This is casting lots to say, where does God want me to go?
Okay.
This was a way of surrendering to God's direction. We're here to serve at the gate, but which gate? Let's let God decide which gate. So we'll cast lots, and he decides. And that's what we're going to see here. They cast lots for the north gate, and we see here in these verses right here, they cast lots. It came out to the north, and the east fell over here in verse 14. So we see the north and the east. Now, if we continue on, we see that Obed-Edom had fell to the south, and to his sons went the storehouse. There's an interesting thing here. This man, blessed by God, was not only a gatekeeper for the south gate, but he was also keeper of the storehouse. Do you see that in that verse?
Yeah.
So there's a double duty. So that would be like guys that are ushers who collect the money and make sure the money's put in the right place, or make sure that things are stored away in the right place. Maybe the guy who moves tables or chairs in the fellowship hall, he's putting them into the storehouse. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There's a lot of modern parallels that we can get in the church with this idea of serving behind the scenes as important ministries. And we continue on. Let me know if this is tracking for you. We see the south gate in verse 15, the west gate in verse 16. Look at verse 17 and 18.
On the east, there were 6 Levites, on the north, 4 daily, on the south, 4 daily, and at the storehouse, 2 by 2. At the Parbar on the west, there were 4 at the highway and 2 at the Parbar.
Okay, so if you add up all these numbers, it equals 22 teams.
Okay.
Now, there were more than 6 guys, but there were 6 teams with 6 supervisors. Do you get that?
Yeah.
And that happens in a modern church where you got the coffee making team, but somebody's the head of the team. There might be a couple of people that are heads of that team or that ministry. Maybe the parking lot attendants, and there are a couple of guys that are in charge of the parking lot attendants. And that's what it's talking about here. 22 teams, 6, 4, 4, 2, and 2 at the Parbar. What's the Parbar? I read that. I went, I've never heard that term before. It's only used a couple of places in the whole Old Testament. And here's where I just want to show you very quickly. I want to go to 3 illustrations. The first one is what Solomon's temple was going to look like. Remember, everything about these assignments is about the future temple. And here's what the exterior looked like. And we got all these things, but I want you to specifically notice this area right here. You see this area along the side and around to the back and around the other side?
Yeah.
And it's 3 stories tall. There's 3 stories here. This is the Parbar. Now I want to show you another illustration that I found of Solomon's temple, and that's the layout. And here it is. Around this area that we just saw in that exterior shot, this 3-story tall area of chambers and offices for the priests. This is 3 stories long, and they come out into this kind of portico, or this place where they could come out of their rooms, come out of the chambers, they could move things around. They could do that in the Parbar. And the last one I wanted to show you again, where it makes sense, is This one right here. And you can see in this illustration where it says right here, the priest's rooms and storage, and it's pointed to this area 3 stories tall that goes all the way around the temple. And it's this portico right here, that gray area that I'm pointing to, is this Parbar, where it's the priests could come out of their offices and out of the storage and walk in this area. And there were people that were in charge of making sure that nobody came into the offices of the priests or into the storage rooms that wasn't authorized to be there. You see what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
So I just had fun doing a little research into it. And it's basically a colonnade or a portico. It's very similar to later when Herod builds the temple. Remember that portico of Solomon that was this big, long area that had rooms off to the side, but there was a big walkway where Jesus dealt with the money changers. This is the predecessor for that idea of a colonnade where the priests could come out of their rooms and move things out of storage, and later abuse that by making it into a money changing area. But we go back here and finish this up. We see these teams who are going to function in the gates and the storehouse and the Parbar. And these, in verse 19, were the divisions of the gatekeepers of the sons of Korah and the sons of Merari. We saw that already. Now, then it moves from the gatekeepers to another area of ministry that's important for us even today, and that's the Levites, their relatives, who had charge of the treasures of the house of God and of the treasures of the dedicated gifts. Now, I broke that down a little bit. These are basically the people who keep account of the money and the treasures. In a church, it may be people that keep track of the finances, people that are collecting the funds and making sure that it gets in the right bank account, and that it is accounted for in the books.
Yeah.
These are the financial people in the temple and in our churches, people that are, again, behind the scenes. You may never know who the bookkeeper of the church is, but he's got an important role in the church. And we see that in these verses. And I just wanted to break this down. It goes here. They had charge of the treasures of the house of the Lord. So you go, what are the treasures of the house of the Lord? If we look down here, we see that the house of the Lord collected offerings, right? They're going to bring them to the temple. They brought them to the tabernacle. They're going to bring them to the temple. And then down here it says the Gershom, the sons of Moses, were officers over the treasures. So now this is the stuff, the treasures. Now down below it talks about in verse 26, the people who were in charge of the treasures of the dedicated gifts, which King David and the heads of the households and the commanders of the thousands and hundreds and commanders of the army had dedicated. Now that's interesting, because what you get is you have a series of gifts that come about by people making dedications of either stuff or money. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So we have offerings and we have gifts. And then in verse 27, we see another area of treasures, and that's plunder. These commanders were up in verse 26, commanders of thousands and hundreds, commanders of the army. They dedicated part of the spoil won in battles to repair the house of the Lord. Now, that is another area of treasure, the plunder from the victories. Okay. And then the last was over the equipment. In another area of First Chronicles, we talked about guys that were in charge of the furniture, guys that were in charge of the menorah, guys that were in charge of the showbread table. And the storehouse would have been the bakery and all of the goods. We talked about those in earlier chapters. Remember?
Yeah.
Now, so we saw a list of all the kinds of treasures in the temple. And any church today will have things that are worth money. But maybe they've invested in a group of tables that are expensive tables, or chairs that are expensive, or the plates for communion, or whatever it is. That every church today has stuff of value that has to be supervised.
Yep.
And it's not good for us to sit in the church and say, well, let the pastor do all that. No, it's not the pastor's job. The pastor's job is to minister and preach, pray for the congregation. There are jobs in the church that are behind the scene jobs that God calls people of strength to do. You see how that fits into this chapter?
Yeah.
And I like it because it's a significant chapter to this idea of serving when people really don't see you serve. And we're going to end up here with these last few verses going down. We see the next section of service from 29 to 32 is offices outside the temple. Flip over to chapter 23, verse 4.
Okay.
We talked about this when we did that study. I mentioned it, but here is the reason explained. Go ahead and read 23, verse 4.
Okay. Of these, 24,000 were to oversee the work of the house of the Lord, and 6,000 were officers and judges.
Okay, remember that term, officers and judges. And I said at the time, these are not guys in the temple. These are guys out in the communities doing the job of officiating, judging, and government officials. Okay?
Right.
But outside of the temple, we see that in verse 29, it says, these sons were assigned to outside duties for Israel as officers and judges. And so, verse 30, they had charge of the affairs of Israel. And there were groups of guys, 1,700 guys, who were in charge of the affairs of Israel west of the Jordan. Now, if you think of the Jordan, west of the Jordan would be where Jerusalem and that whole area of Israel proper, right?
Yep.
And they had for all the work of the Lord and the service of the king on the west side of the Jordan. And then in verse 31, in the Transjordan area on the east side of the Jordan, right there, even though they're outside of the specific ministry in the temple, they are going to be responsible for administering the affairs of Israel. And verse 31 says, this is in the 40th year of David's reign. He appointed all these guys. And it says, and King David in verse 32, and King David made them overseers, right? So you go, what's the significance of the 40th year of his reign?
Yeah, I don't know.
He reigned for 40 years.
Okay, so it's the last one.
We're going to see in the last chapter of First Chronicles that David reigned for 40 years. So the last thing he does, he's turning over the kingdom to Solomon. The last thing he does is appoint all these behind the scenes servants. Okay?
Okay.
Significant. And then the last thing we see in that last verse, he appointed all these guys concerning all the affairs of God and the king. And what we see here is that these servants who served God served spiritually. These might be Sunday school teachers, they might be small group leaders, they might be guys that are serving behind the scenes, but serving spiritually. And then there are guys who serve politically, and that might be in the bookkeeping and in the accounting and in the even government relations. When we go out and meet in a park or something, we have to get government approval. There are guys that serve in the capacity of the affairs of the king or the affairs of the government. Do a takeaway of this chapter. After we've done these verses, what would you say as a takeaway we can grasp here?
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the other chapters we've done, just the emphasis on the people who are behind the scenes. You can have an important role strengthened by God to fulfill that's behind the scenes, that's not in front of everyone.
But it's still a very important role that God has a plan for it. He organizes it. He knows who's going to serve in it. These aren't just by accident. These are people who are called to serve and to supervise those who serve. Very important role in the church today. So if you're serving as an usher, don't think that you're serving in a second-class ministry. It's a ministry that's behind the scenes, yes, but it's a ministry that's not behind what God wants to do in the church. We've been talking about serving God in the background. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called The Peanut Butter Jar Principle of Serving Christ. It's out of 2 Timothy chapter 2, and I think you'll enjoy it. And listen, we're going to continue our study next week. And until then, God bless you.